I was 7 when they left me. I remember the way my mother held my hand that morning, her fingers tense, like she was forcing herself to touch me. My father walked a step ahead, his jaw set, staring straight ahead as if this were just another errand, something to check off his to-do list before lunch. I was wearing my best clothes, a navy sweater and corduroy pants, because my mother always insisted on keeping up appearances. I didn't know it at the time, but she wanted me to look presentable when she handed me over, like an unwanted gift rewrapped with a bow. The orphanage was a cold, gray place, the kind of building that had existed for 100 years without a single child ever laughing in it. The walls smelled of bleach and something sour, and the air was thick with the sound of nothing, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. "We'll be back soon," my mother lied. My father had already turned away, walking back toward the door. He never looked at me once. I was 7, but I wasn't stupid. I knew what this was. Why? The word barely made it out of my throat, but I managed to say it. What did I do? My mother swallowed hard, her lips tightening. Then she knelt down, smoothing a hand over my hair like she still had the right to touch me. "It's not about you, darling. We need time to figure things out." Lies. All of it. I clung to the sleeve of her coat, my little hands gripping the fabric. "Please, don't go." She pulled away so fast I nearly lost my balance. A woman in a stiff blue dress placed a hand on my shoulder, her nails digging into my sweater. "Come along, sweetheart. Let's get you settled." And just like that, they were gone. I ran to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. I watched them step into their polished black car, the one that still had my drawings tucked into the glove compartment. My mother wiped at her eyes, dabbing carefully so her mascara wouldn't smudge. My father said something to her, and they drove away without looking back. The woman in the blue dress sighed. "You'll get used to it here." She was wrong. I spent my first night curled up on a hard mattress in a room filled with beds, but no warmth. I whispered into the dark, pretending my mother could still hear me. "I'll be good. I promise. Just come back." No one came. No one ever would. Hunger was the first thing I learned to live with. The orphanage wasn't cruel, not in the way that left bruises on your skin, but it was cold in a way that seeped into your bones. Breakfast was a bowl of thin porridge that tasted like paper, lunch was stale bread with a slice of something they called cheese, and dinner was soup so watered down it might as well have been dirty dishwater. Some nights, I'd lie awake, my stomach gnawing at itself, dreaming about the warm meals my mother used to serve. Roast chicken. Buttered rolls. Spaghetti with too much Parmesan. But dreams didn't fill your belly. The loneliness came next. The other kids were rough around the edges, sharp in the places where I was still soft. Most of them had been there for years, hardened by too many empty promises and too many nights waiting for parents who never came back. I was the new one, the easy target. The first time they took my bread, I didn't fight back. The second time, I did. That was my first mistake. "You think you're better than us, rich boy," one of the older kids sneered. His name was Victor, and he was everything I wasn't: big, mean, and loud. He grabbed my collar and shoved me against the dining table, knocking my bowl to the floor. The watery soup splattered across my shoes. I started, but the words dried up when his fist tightened in my shirt. He laughed. "You talk too fancy. That's how we know." I tried to explain that I wasn't rich, not anymore. My parents had money, sure, but they didn't want me. That didn't seem to matter to Victor. He shoved me again, and when I hit the ground, the others laughed. That's what you had to do in the orphanage: laugh when someone else fell, or risk being the next one on the floor. I learned quickly after that. I learned to eat fast, to keep my head down, to stop speaking in full sentences so they wouldn't call me a fancy boy anymore. I learned to fight not to win, but just enough to show I wasn't easy prey. But I also learned something else. There was a library. It wasn't much, just a single bookshelf stuffed with old, dog-eared paperbacks, but it was something. While the other kids played outside, shoving each other in the dirt, I sat cross-legged on the floor, my nose buried in the pages of worlds that weren't mine. Books became my escape. I read about heroes who overcame impossible odds, about lost boys who found their way home, about kids who had nothing but still became something. And for the first time since my parents left me here, I felt something like hope. I started writing. At first, it was just little things, scribbles in the margins of old notebooks, short stories I never showed anyone. But the words gave me something the orphanage never could. Control. In my stories, I wasn't hungry. I wasn't alone. I wasn't the boy whose parents abandoned him, I was the boy who mattered. One day, one of the caretakers found one of my stories. "This is good," she murmured, flipping through the pages. "Really good." It was the first kind thing anyone had said to me in a long, long time. And I held on to that. I was 25 the day they came back. By then, I had a name. Not the one they gave me at birth, but one I built for myself, Oliver Gray, best-selling author. My books had made their way into homes, libraries, and even movie scripts. People read my stories and saw strength in the characters I created. They called me inspiring, brave, a survivor. Funny how none of them knew that the hardest battle I ever fought wasn't in my books, it was the one I had with my own past. I was at a book signing in a small shop in New York when I saw them. My mother's face had barely changed, still polished and elegant, though there were more lines around her eyes now. My father had grayed at the temples, but his suit was just as crisp as I remembered. They didn't look like people searching for a lost son. They looked like people walking into a business meeting, ready to negotiate. I kept signing books, pretending not to notice as they made their way to the front of the line. But when my mother said my name, my old name, I felt it like a punch to the gut. James. I froze, the pen hovering over the page. It was the first time I'd heard that name in nearly 2 decades. Slowly, I looked up. My mother's eyes were glassy with unshed tears, and for a second, I let myself wonder if they were real. My father, standing beside her, cleared his throat. He looked uncomfortable, like he hadn't expected me to be so different from the boy they abandoned. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands over the book in front of me. "You must have the wrong person." My mother let out a soft gasp, her hand fluttering to her chest. "No, darling. It's us. Your parents." The words felt foreign coming from her lips. I tilted my head, pretending to think. My parents? No, that can't be right. My parents died years ago. She flinched. My father's jaw tightened. "We're sorry," he said, his voice low, controlled. "For everything." I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that tasted like bile in my throat. Sorry. That was it? A single word to erase years of hunger, loneliness, and nights spent wondering why I wasn't good enough to keep? Why now? I asked, my voice calm, measured. Why come back after all this time? My mother sniffled, dabbing at her eyes. We saw your books, your success. We're so proud of you. Proud. Another meaningless word. I looked at the line of people waiting behind them, at the readers who actually cared about my words, my stories. Then I looked back at the two people who once threw me away like an old toy, only to come crawling back when they realized I had value. It was all so pathetically predictable. Let's talk somewhere private, my father suggested, glancing around. We don't want to make a scene. I smiled. Oh, but I do. And then I turned to the audience. Everyone, I said, raising my voice just enough for the crowd to hear. These lovely people in front of me? They're my parents. The ones who abandoned me at an orphanage when I was 7. The room went silent. My mother's face went pale. My father took a small step back, as if he could physically retreat from the truth. I was just about to sign a book for them, I continued, flipping to the title page. I should make it extra special, don't you think? And with slow, deliberate strokes, I wrote. To the parents who left me behind. I made it without you. I slid the book across the table, my hands steady, my heart pounding. Now, I said, looking them both in the eye. Are you sure you want my signature? For a moment, the world was utterly silent. My mother's hands trembled as she clutched the book, her fingers curling around the edges like she wanted to rip out the page. My father, ever the composed businessman, clenched his jaw so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. The audience, though, they saw everything. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some people gasped. Others turned to each other, murmuring in shock. A woman near the front covered her mouth, her wide eyes darting between me and the two people who claimed to be my parents. I let them squirm. My father recovered first. He let out a breath, forcing a tight smile. Son, please. Let's not do this in front of. You don't get to call me that. My voice was calm, but my chest burned. You lost that right the moment you walked away. My mother finally spoke, her voice soft, almost pleading. James, we were young. We made mistakes. We weren't ready for a child. Then why did you have one? She flinched. She had no answer for that. I turned my gaze to my father, whose composure was cracking, piece by piece. You left me in a place where I went to bed hungry, where I had to fight for scraps. Where no one held me when I was scared. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a quiet blade. And you expect me to welcome you back because you're suddenly interested in the man I've become? It's not like that, my mother insisted. We love you. I laughed. Cold. Sharp. You don't love me. You love what I've achieved. The crowd was watching, their eyes fixed on the unraveling spectacle. Phones were out, cameras recording. My parents hadn't just walked into a conversation, they had walked into an open courtroom, and the jury was the world. Their expressions flickered with realization. This wasn't a reunion. This was an exposure. My father exhaled, his patience running thin. We thought you'd be happy to see us. Happy? I repeated, incredulous. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The air in the bookstore felt thick, heavy. My mother reached for me, but I stepped back, out of her reach. I spent years wondering what I did wrong, I said, my voice steady. Why I wasn't enough for you. And now, after all this time, I finally understand. I met my father's gaze, watching as his confidence crumbled. It was never about me, I said. It was always about you. And just like that, I ended it. I turned to the next person in line, an elderly woman clutching a copy of my book. Who should I make this out to? She hesitated for a moment, glancing at my parents before giving me a warm smile. Alice. Just Alice. I smiled back, picking up my pen. Alice it is. Behind me, my parents hesitated, as if unsure whether to fight or flee. But they must have realized there was nothing left to say, because a few seconds later, they turned and walked out of my life once again. This time, it was my choice. I should have felt triumphant. Victorious. Instead, I felt empty. That night, after the book signing, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The world outside was alive, cars honking, neon signs flickering, laughter rising from the streets below. But inside, it was just me and the silence. A part of me had thought this moment would bring closure. That finally confronting them, exposing them, would erase the years of pain they left behind. But the past didn't disappear just because you faced it head-on. It lingered. Then, my phone buzzed. I hesitated before picking it up. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Almost. But something inside me, curiosity, bitterness, some twisted sense of closure, made me answer. I didn't speak first. I just waited. A soft breath came through the line, then a hesitant voice. James? I closed my eyes. My mother. What do you want? I asked, my tone flat. A shaky exhale. I know you don't owe us anything, she said. I know we failed you. I said nothing. She took my silence as permission to continue. I need you to understand. We weren't struggling financially when we left you. That wasn't the problem. I clenched my jaw. Then what was? We were selfish. I hadn't expected her to admit it so easily. We were young, she whispered. Your father had just gotten his first real opportunity. A child didn't fit into the life we wanted. We told ourselves you'd be better off, that someone else would love you more than we could. I forced a bitter laugh. And yet, no one did. She made a choked sound, like she was holding back a sob. I've lived with that guilt every day. I thought about finding you, but I was afraid. Afraid of what you'd say. Afraid of seeing what we did to you. Yet you only came back when I had something to offer. No, she insisted. It wasn't about the money. Then what? I demanded. Why now? A beat of silence. Then, the truth. Because I wanted to know if you could ever forgive us. I let those words settle between us. Heavy. Unanswered. I could hear her breathing, waiting, hoping. And for a fleeting moment, I wondered if I said yes, if I gave her the absolution she wanted, would it change anything? Would it undo the nights I spent curled up in a freezing orphanage, the hunger that gnawed my ribs, the years I spent clawing my way out of the darkness they left me in? No. It wouldn't. Finally, I spoke. I built myself from the ashes you left behind. My voice was steady, final. I don't need you. Not anymore. A broken sob slipped through the phone. James, please. I ended the call. And this time, I knew there would be no going back. The phone sat on the table, its screen dark and silent. For a long time, I just stared at it, half expecting it to ring again, half dreading that it would. But the call didn't come. My mother had said her piece, and I had said mine. There was nothing left to be said. I should have felt relief. Maybe even satisfaction. Instead, all I felt was tired. Not sad, not regretful, just tired. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing a hand over my face. The weight of my past was still there, but it no longer crushed me the way it once did. It no longer dictated my future. For so long, I had imagined this moment. I had told myself that if I ever saw them again, I would spit venom, make them feel every ounce of the pain they left behind. And I had, in a way. I had exposed them, humiliated them. I had made them feel small. But standing there, watching them leave a second time, I realized something. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need their suffering to validate my own. I had already won. Not in the way I had once dreamed, not by making them beg, not by watching them crumble. But by proving, through every page I had written, through every word I had spoken, that I had built a life without them. That I had risen from the emptiness they left me with and made something real, something permanent. I had survived. And now, it was time to live. I stood up, stretched, and looked out at the city. It was still buzzing, still moving, still alive. Just like me. The past would always be a part of me. The scars wouldn't disappear. But they no longer defined me. My story wasn't about them anymore. It was about me. And I was just getting started.